I'm Anthony Romero, the National Director of the American Civil Liberties Union. Well, remarkably little has changed thus far since President Obama took office when it comes to Guantanamo. We were delighted, we were elated when his first 3 executive orders in the first 24 hours of his presidency said that he would shut down Guantanamo within a year, that he would ban torture unequivocally, and he would shut down the secret prisons that were being run by the CIA. We thought we were off to a pretty good start. That seemed like a civil liberties trifecta to us. But frankly, in the last 6, 7 months that we've seen since those first executive orders, there's been very little substantive difference in the way in which the policies are executed, in even the maneuvering of the Obama administration. They have very much backtracked on those initial promises on shutting down the military commissions unequivocally. We fear now that we're in a very different political environment where people want to believe and have faith in this president. He came in with enormous popularity, with an enormous mandate to get us back on track. He still commands enormous popularity in the public opinion polls. And yet when you look at the substantive policies of this president and you compare them to those of George Bush, they're not all that different. The rhetoric is certainly much different. The values that he speaks of are newly refined, but the substantive policy outcomes are not that different. And that perhaps is what concerns us the most, that when people have finally let down their guard and believe that we're back on track to restore civil liberties, that in fact we have an administration that's now mumbling when it comes to those initial promises they made. Well, the president has banned torture under his administration. And he has rejected the enhanced interrogation techniques that are now infamous in the Office of Legal Counsel memos that we secured, the ACLU secured, through the litigation under the Freedom of Information Act. So we're back now to where we were pre-9/11. We don't torture. We don't abuse. We follow the Geneva Conventions. The fact is that there's still a lot of gray area that the president has said that we won't use these very aggressive torture techniques. But we're not entirely sure about these coerced or these enhanced interrogation techniques. How far beyond, where has he drawn the line? We really don't fully know. It's clear to us in some of the initial discussions we've had with the administration, some of these rules, that regarding the Guantanamo military commissions, that while they've banned the use of evidence gleaned from torture, it's certainly possible, in fact we expect them to use interrogation techniques or use evidence gleaned from coerced interrogation techniques. That could fall a little bit below the torture line, but still would be illegal in the pre-9/11 context. We don't fully know what's going on, frankly, in some of the other sites. We're saying we want to close Guantanamo, but we're reading even in these recent newspapers about the wanton mess at Bagram, where there, just in today's newspaper, we read about detainees not having access to lawyers, awful conditions, refusing to come out of their cells as a way to protest their inhumane treatment. And whenever you have a prison or a detention center that is not accessible to members of the press or public or advocates like us at the ACLU, that's a recipe for abuse. What can happen behind closed doors that can't be penetrated can in fact lead to the type of abusive techniques that we saw under the Bush administration. What I think the president fails to understand, and perhaps by the fact that he always refers to himself as commander-in-chief of the nation, is the fact that a concern for civil liberties and human rights on the one hand doesn't obviate or necessarily won't necessarily be at odds with a concern of making sure you have national security and enforce the nation's security as commander-in-chief. And we have the president now who I think is wrong-headed in his unwillingness to look back. The president says that he wishes to look forward, that this is not a time for recriminations. This is not a time for finger-pointing. This is not a time for partisan squabbling. But frankly, unless you look back, and unless you prosecute the individuals who authorized the torture and abuse, who authorized at the highest levels of our government, you create a moral hazard in our government. It means that you can break the law and get away with it. And so individuals down the chain of command in the Department of Defense, in the CIA, who broke the law under President Bush, who are not being prosecuted for what they did and what they knew would happen, there's impunity in the ranks of the government. And unless you were really willing to prosecute individuals at the highest levels of our government who authorized and enabled torture and abuse to happen in our name, you're going to allow that impunity to exist. And you're never going to be able to get us back to a place where torture and abuse of detainees is just anathema. You'll always have the question in people's minds, in soldiers or the CIA officers' minds, maybe I can do it. Maybe I can get away with it. Maybe this is the best way to protect America. And unless you prosecute the individuals who authorize at the highest levels, you're going to have that doubt, and you're going to have the remains of that Bush policy creep into the Obama administration. Absolutely, if not higher. Certainly Cheney, certainly Addington, certainly you and Gonzalez. We have Dick Cheney still say that we never tortured, that we didn't torture people on his watch. Well, that's obviously not the case. We have the documents to show it from our Freedom of Information Act litigation. There are thousands of photos that Obama refuses to release that would show in very explicit detail and troubling detail what exactly torture looks like. And the idea that we still are having a debate about whether or not we did or didn't torture when the facts are clear and unequivocal, whether or not torture should be or should not be allowed, to what level can you have cruel, unusual, and degrading treatment that doesn't rise to the level of torture? Those are troubling questions that are still roiling within the Obama administration. And because we haven't had a clear, decisive action to break with the past, to prosecute those who broke the law, that doubt and that ambiguity is going to continue. Well, we hear those arguments. We hear those arguments directly from the president himself, either in closed-door meetings or in his speeches. And the concern that America can't afford to spend time with some of the most fundamental values of the American Republic is really giving us too short shrift. I mean, certainly no one argues that the president has been dealt a very difficult hand. With 2 wars raging, the health care reform debate, which seems to sometimes be going off track, the economy collapsing. But frankly, America is a lot more than just the bank statements or the assets, the financial assets of our nation. America's greatest assets also have to do with our values. And if we would not be arguing with the fact, if Dick Cheney and Addington and others had gone into Fort Knox and robbed America of $1 billion, we would not be talking about whether or not we ought to be prosecuting them for those crimes. And yet when they authorize torture and abuse at the highest levels, the fact that we're willing to look the other way and say, well, those assets don't really count as much as the financial assets. That's just not true. I mean, America was founded both on a concern for economic prosperity and taxation without representation and concerns about the American colonies fighting the British crown, but they were also fighting tyranny. They were fighting for justice. They were fighting for due process. And those founding documents had much more to do with certain core aspirations and values that we cannot afford to put on the back burner and say we don't have the time or the energy or the luxury to deal with these issues. Those are as much about our patrimony as anything that we own or might sell or might transact or might import or export. What we have best is our core commitment to those values, which have been severely undercut over the last 8 years. You move them stateside. Our states and our prisons are perfectly equipped to handle terrorism suspects. We have a number of some very high-level terrorism suspects who've been convicted who are being held in our nation's prisons. You would make sure you put the best prosecutors working on those cases. You throw all the evidence you can amass from the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Defense, the Department of State. You put them in front of a legitimate federal court that's tried and true, that's been used in hundreds of cases to prosecute terrorism cases over the last 15, 20 years. And you use our court system. That's not what they're going down the path. The president now is trying to tinker with the Guantanamo military commissions. If he ships the prisoners on shore, he now wants to ameliorate, in their words, some of the worst problems of the Military Commissions Act. The president made rather clear when he was candidate Obama and not President Obama that he would reject the Military Commissions Act. Well, tinkering at the edges of the Military Commissions Act doesn't sound like rejecting the Military Commissions Act. You need to just ship them stateside, prosecute them, throw the book at them, and if you succeed, detain them for whatever period of time is properly determined by a federal judge. And if you don't succeed in a conviction, they have to be released. That's our legal system. America has a remarkable history of both protecting civil liberties and trampling on them. I mean, surely we have to understand that America was really at the forefront of pushing through a concern for human rights in the aftermath of World War II. It was the atrocities that we saw with the Germans and with the others, the Italians and the Japanese, that made us codify under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights a uniform code for the protection of human rights. That was America's patrimony as much as anything else. That was Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR who did all that. And frankly, it served as a model for many of the nations many of the world's leading nations, many of the world's leading industrial countries. But frankly, what's happened over the last 8 years has been that we've set these rules and norms up, we've espoused them, we've championed them for decades, and we broke them. We went back on those commitments and those promises. We thought that the rules didn't have to apply to us, that the Chinese shouldn't torture, but we can, that the Cubans shouldn't hold people indefinitely without charge or trial, but we can, that we can hide things from the public and the press and Congress in America in a way that we would denounce any country, any government from doing that to their citizens. And so what we've seen is just the fact that there's been an enormous amount of hypocrisy, of double standards. An America that always championed these issues for other countries and said these were the core issues for us in our nation, that this, in fact, now is, the rules are different for us. And unless we take that head on, that double standard, that hypocrisy that we get criticized about overseas will certainly continue. We still see, in fact, that this administration is very closed when it comes to matters of national security. We think it's a huge mistake that the president decided to try to shut down the release of more than 2,000 photographs that show torture and abuse in Afghanistan, in Iraq, at Guantanamo. This is a lawsuit, just to be clear, this is a lawsuit we filed in 2003. We filed this lawsuit asking the government for any and all documents that talked about torture and abuse happening on detainees held by the American government. We didn't know what was happening. We were fishing. Then the photographs of Abu Ghraib come to light in 2004. And all of a sudden, this lawsuit grows into enormous significance, where we begin to pull out documents from the FBI, from the Department of Defense, from the CIA. And then we argue and we litigate over the number of years about whether or not the word document includes the photographs taken or held by the U.S. government. And after winning at 2 different courts and having the government appeal for both of our wins at those levels, the Holder Justice Department said, okay, we'll give up the photographs. They are documents. They are relevant to your Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. And then the president backtracks because he's worried about the backlash that will be unleashed from the photographs. And certainly no one wants to see a backlash. I mean, we at the ACLU don't want to see mayhem or destruction. We don't want to see our soldiers put in harm's way. But frankly, what's going to put our soldiers in harm's way is not the release of the photos, it's the fact that we've tortured and abused individuals. And we've captured those very policies on photographs and videos. And the only way you're going to create the political will to ensure that we never do that again is to make sure we look at it straight in the face. We have to understand what really went on to create the political will, to make sure that we prosecute those who allowed that to happen, and to make sure that we put in place the sufficient deterrence that going forward no one else will break the law quite the way that we saw under the Bush years. Well, if you're poor or you're a minority, the criminal justice system doesn't work for you. You've got the deck of cards is stacked against you. And it's clear that the criminal justice system treats people who have resources or treats people who are not minorities very differently. We can see that already in some of the efforts we've begun to address. I mean, here you have to give the Obama administration a great deal of credit in helping erase the differences between crack and powder cocaine, where crack cocaine was dealt with much more aggressively than powder cocaine, and that was basically a racial disparity. It was mostly whites who would be able to afford or would use powder cocaine, and often it was minorities and low-income people using crack cocaine. But frankly, when you look at the death penalty and you look at the individuals who often receive the death sentences, they often have to do with poor lawyers because we have not resourced the criminal justice system or the public defender system well. You deal with often the biases of juries, especially in southern states and places where discrimination is still rampant. You deal with politicians and some district attorneys and state's attorneys general who are using race and crime as a way to run for office and to curry the favor of conservative and often white voters. And so what we have to understand is that the criminal justice system is really stacked against people who are poor or low income. And we have to resource that system in a way that's much more significant. We still have people going who are on death row whose lawyers were asleep during their trials, whose lawyers didn't do discovery in cases of life or death, who had never done a capital defense case, who didn't have access to the full mitigation and investigative experts that you need in a death penalty case. In a lot of places, we're still putting people to death by winging it. People who are there and perhaps even are innocent. That's one of the most remarkable things about the development with DNA evidence. It's shown clearly now that there are people who have been on death row who now, through DNA evidence, we can show were fully innocent and have been exonerated, more than 100 or so individuals over the last several years. That should make us think twice about the infallibility of putting someone to death. That should make us think twice about the fallibility of our criminal justice system. That should make us have the political will just to step back from it and say, look, this system doesn't work. We need to abolish the death penalty. That no matter how great a system we construct, it will be fallible. And taking someone's life, which is it's the most irreversible error that you can ever commit, is just too great a stake to run the risk that you're going to put one innocent person to death. And that's why we've always believed the death penalty should be utterly and completely abolished, no matter what the set of circumstances, no matter what the crime, because it can never work. And it's certainly not working well when it comes to low-income and minority people. Well, I think if you look at Canada, for instance, you have increasing protection for civil liberties and civil rights. They enacted something similar to the Patriot Act in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And yet they've backed away much more clearly from some of those law enforcement powers. You see some of the nations in Western Europe who have been absolutely shocked at the commission of torture and even been troubled by their own involvement in practices like rendition, where you have rendition as a polite word for kidnapping people and shipping them off to a country where they'll be tortured. And so you have these big debates roiling in places like Italy, in Great Britain, and elsewhere, about how those practices just don't comport with their own concerns and their own protections for human rights. And so America right now is not leading the pack on human rights or civil liberties. America is really trailing the crowd. And unless we take very definitive steps to restore our leadership role and showing that we can deal with these issues at home, that we'll prosecute the criminals who broke the law, that we will go back to our tried and true federal court system, that we will have a fully open and transparent government, that we will shut down surveillance techniques that focus on law-abiding Americans who've done nothing wrong. Unless we do all that, we're going to continue to trail the pack. Now, we've progressed in the gay rights movement, but we haven't progressed as a result of government policies, or certainly not leadership at the federal level. I mean, I think what's remarkable is that the progress we've made despite the opposition from the federal government or some of the state governments. It would have been unthinkable to me. I'm 44 years old 2 weeks ago. When I was growing up, I would have thought impossible for gay people to marry. Now we have it in many states, including in some of the most remarkable states, that you can actually be pronounced husband and wife. You can get married in Dubuque, but you can't get married in Chelsea or in San Francisco. Frankly, the fact that we made progress in places like that, in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, I think that speaks volumes about the power and the dynamism of the gay rights community. But we see still that federal government officials mumble when it comes to questions around gay rights, that these are not equal rights of ordinary American citizens. We saw the Obama administration submit this brief to defend the Defense of Marriage Act, an indefensible piece of law that was signed by President Clinton. Shows you that, in fact, Democrats can sometimes not be any better than Republicans on some of the key civil rights, civil liberties issues. And here you had the Obama administration file this brief defending the law in some of the most disgusting rhetoric and language. I understand the fact that the Justice Department has to defend the laws enacted by Congress, but the way they did so in that brief was really offensive to many gay and lesbian people across this country. And the fact that they had such a tin ear, that they couldn't realize that the way they were going to defend this law was going to be in a way that would really infuriate gay and lesbian people across the country who thought that we had embarked upon a very different time in our nation's history. And I think it's great that President Obama actually says the words gay and lesbian. I think it was notable that at the NAACP convention he talked about gay people still not having their civil rights. And I think it's great that he had this ceremony commemorating the 40th anniversary of Stonewall at the White House. But frankly, talk is cheap. And there's only so long that a very eloquent and very thoughtful and very charismatic president will be able to get away on talk alone. Frankly, the policies and the outcomes and the decisions of that government has to measure up to the talk that both led him into the White House and that is still allowing him to lead the public in very significant ways. At one point, we all tune off when people's actions don't measure up to their words. I don't think anyone legitimately can say that Don't Ask, Don't Tell has worked. Even the wife of the author of that the terrible policy ran on a campaign saying it was a mistake to put Don't Ask, Don't Tell in place. That you created a witch hunt in the military. That you can be gay, you just can't ask about it, you can't tell anyone about it. But if you tell someone or someone asks about it, then you can still be pushed out of the military. It's ridiculous. They promised to undo Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the Obama administration. But they're saying now that they'll get to it in their sweet old time. It's really quite different if you're an openly gay or lesbian serving in the military, putting your life down on the line for our country, and yet your government can discriminate against you and you could lose your job even as you lay down your life for your country. You could still be kicked out from that post or that position. And frankly, there's no reason why we ought to wait. It's not as if we're going to be able to fix the economy or the health care or the environment or even these wars in the near future. And that, frankly, social change is not a sequential piece. This is not like your college prerequisites where you take economics 101 before you go to economics 201. Frankly, these issues all have to be dealt with aggressively. And the idea that we will wait to deal with them just shows, in fact, that they're not a huge priority for this administration the way we had hoped and that in the way that many had voted for them to bring about that change. I find it remarkable that increasingly the Obama administration is sustaining withering attacks, not just from civil libertarians about human rights and civil liberties, but from the gay community, from the women's community, from young people, from the anti-war activists. I mean, those were the base that often created the seedbed that got him elected. And yet some of the major issues that I think propelled so many young people and so many different people to vote for this president are now the ones that we find on the back burner, I think is actually not a very good political agenda. It doesn't take a lot for a 25-year-old to become disenchanted once again with the political process. And frankly, when folks turned out in record numbers and gave record amounts of money, it's because they wanted to see swift, decisive change. And that has yet not come about. Well, certainly giving the full protection of health benefits to federal government employees, which is not what he's done, would be an important first step. Look, President Obama is like a CEO of a major corporation, right? He's just like as if he were the CEO of Walt Disney or Apple. And if you're concerned about the health and well-being of your employees, you want to protect them. You want to protect them and their families. I think it is remarkable that this president has said that even though a CEO of the government workers of the United States of America, that he won't provide health care benefits for same-sex partners who work for or with the federal government. That's something he could do. That's something he ought to do. Frankly, if Apple can get around to it, or Nike can get around to it, and Walt Disney can get around to it, I think the CEO of the United States of America can get around to that too. He doesn't need Congress. He could just implement that. That was also another misstep on the gay rights front. You had DOMA, you had the mumbling on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, you had the lack of providing full health care benefits for federal government employees. People begin to scratch their heads and wondering whether or not we're going to see the type of change we were hoping for. And that's the type of change that the president can bring about. He could also use the bully pulpit to be very clear around marriage. And in fact, the president has said in his books and his public speaking that he struggles with the idea around marriage for lesbian and gay people. Not that hard. Frankly, we don't have the same protections that straight people have. You know, he is protected by the law, the president's protected by the law, he's got 2 beautiful daughters and a wonderful first lady who's his wife, and the law protects their family, protects them from discrimination, protects them in case anything were to go wrong with either one of the parents. Gay people across this country don't have the benefit of those legal protections. And no matter how much they say they want to treat us like equal citizens and give us our full rights, the fact is, unless you move and you implement on those rights, it's just rhetoric, it's just a hortatory language. And frankly, the time has come for bold, decisive leadership. And we've seen it in states all across this country. I mean, frankly, Massachusetts has married gay people now for over a year and some months. And the institution of marriage, I don't think, is any weaker in Massachusetts than it was 3 years ago. We've seen it in Connecticut. And frankly, decisive, clear action from the federal government, I think, is essential and necessary. And it's still not there. Frankly, the ACLU is almost 90 years old. We have to evolve to a different set of circumstances. We have to understand how things are playing out. Sometimes we've made mistakes. There was an enormous debate at the ACLU during World War II around Japanese-American internment. There were good civil libertarians who thought that we ought to give FDR the benefit of the doubt, that it was necessary to secure the West Coast and therefore intern Japanese Americans. But fortunately, there were other good civil libertarians who said, no way, that we can never abide that. And it was our Northern California affiliate, our California offices, who broke rank, actually, with some of the leaders in the national office and brought the Korematsu case, the Supreme Court case that we filed in 1941, lost in 1944, where the constitutionality of Japanese Americans being interned was upheld by the Supreme Court. And there was some 50 years later until we got reparations for Japanese Americans. So the ACLU itself has not always been on the right side of these issues. In the 1950s, we had a very difficult period where, in fact, our leadership got too cozy with Hoover's FBI. We were giving them minutes of our meetings. We tried so hard to show that we weren't communists that we expelled a couple of communists who were in the ranks of both the board and the staff of the ACLU. And we look back as an organization and think that those were some of the saddest moments in our organization's history. That as good as we can point to fighting the internment of Japanese Americans, there were moments when we were falling prey to the Red Scare of the 1950s. And part of what we learned from that, I think we continue to learn, is the need to stand up to these abuses of power, no matter who's president, no matter how popular, no matter how well-liked, no matter what the challenges we confront in a particular context. That's whenever we begin to think in ways that, well, maybe we should just negotiate and compromise on some core issues and some core values that ought not to be compromised. That's when we get into perilous terrain. At one point, the ACLU had a policy of opposing metal detectors at airports. It was an absolutist approach to the fact that, that's an unreasonable search and seizure. Over the years, and as we got to understand better the terrorist threat that does present at airports in particular, we changed that policy. And we said, look, the most important thing is to make it as least intrusive as possible. That a metal detector is really quite different than strip searching someone at the airport. So we can live with a metal detector. We won't live with strip searching all airport passengers. And part of what we've had to do, as I think any organization must do, is to adapt and change to the times, but keep an eye on core principles and keep asking yourself the question that, are we not giving up the ghost when it comes to really important values? And frankly, I think the way we comported ourselves and the vigor of our dissent in the initial aftermath of 9/11, where President Bush began to take more and more law enforcement powers, we were a lone voice. I started work on September 4th, 2001. And I thought as the first person to come into the ACLU in over 40 years from outside the organization, I thought that one of my primary goals would be to help revivify a concern for civil liberties. When I was interviewing for this job, I was 35 years old at the time. A lot of my contemporaries and friends said it's a wonderful organization, but perhaps its time had come and gone, that it didn't seem as an organization that was about the current struggles for civil liberties and civil rights. And so much of the concerns I had coming in would be how to bring in a new generation of civil libertarians, how to show that these issues are not the issues that our parents or grandparents fought for and won, but the issues for us and our subsequent generations. And then lo and behold, a week later, with the events of September 11th, the initial task, which I really hadn't wrapped my mind around how to do it, became much easier to do. It was clear that the civil liberties issues that we were going to be confronting in the aftermath of 9/11 would be the questions for us and for our subsequent generations. That the war on terror would unleash an enormous assault on civil liberties, just like we had seen during the Second World War, during the Vietnam War, and other periods where our nation's been tried and had difficulties with national security or questions around terrorism within the United States. And so we knew we'd be on the front lines. Who knew, though, that we would be exactly as challenged as we were under the Bush years? And perhaps it was a bit of optimism, a bit of idealism. Perhaps it was thinking that our elected officials or appointed officials would have learned the mistakes of the past. But what we endured under 8 years of George Bush was absolutely breathtaking. No one would have ever have imagined, for instance, that we would be detaining individuals, American citizens, apprehended on American soil, without charge or without access to lawyers. It was unfathomable to think that America, which had always been the champion of human rights and had always denounced torture and abuse in dictatorships and totalitarian regimes, would ourselves become the torturers. It was unthinkable that the president would act without the approval of Congress or without going to any federal court when he would begin a surveillance program on the activities and communications of law-abiding Americans. And so we saw all of this at a very fast clip, at an enormous volume over the last 8 years. And the cleanup we now confront, the cleanup we confront with President Obama as president, as the American people, members of Congress, is not like taking out the garbage. It's not like vacating the Bush cronies and getting rid of the Ashcrofts and Gonzaleses and Rumsfelds and Cheneys of the world. This is much more akin to cleaning up a toxic waste dump. That what they've done to the rule of law has been so severe and so systemic that it will take us years, if not generations, to fully recover our moral standing at home and abroad. They take authority very easily. They take instructions and edicts from on high very easily, very simply. I mean, look, the ACLU's beauty is the fact that we question authority. And we question it of the government, we question it of President Bush, we question it of President Obama, they question it of me, I question it of the board, and it is a wonderful, dynamic, sometimes messy, sometimes cranky, sometimes process-oriented place, but we would never have it any other way. Part of what makes the ACLU, I think, so strong is the fact that we have diverse voices who often raise very different points of view. I talked about the Freedom of Information Act lawsuit earlier, where we were able to glean over 130,000 pages of documents from the U.S. government, including the Office of Legal Counsel memos from you and Addington and others. Well, that lawsuit was filed by two very junior attorneys who, when they first presented the idea of using the Freedom of Information Act, a very senior Supreme Court litigator said to them, "I'll give you $1 for every page you get." And in most other places, like a normal law firm, those young lawyers would have been cowed. They would have kind of walked away into their offices with their tail between their legs and said, okay, this is futile. Luckily, because the people we attract are the type of people we want, they said, to hell with it. We're going to follow anyway. And these two young lawyers, who together probably don't even get to 60 some odd years old, which is probably the age of the person who said they'll never get the documents from the government, have literally changed the face of American history. That if they had not persevered and questioned the authority within the ACLU, we wouldn't have the Office of Legal Counsel memos. We wouldn't know about the rampant torture and abuse that happened at Guantanamo, at Abu Ghraib, and elsewhere. We wouldn't know how we authorized the use of insects on detainees and putting them in a cramped box for 18 hours, or submerging them in 40-degree water for 20 minutes, or 60-degree water for an hour. We wouldn't know all those facts. And so frankly, it's the ability to kind of raise questions, to not be afraid of debate, to not be afraid of differences of opinion. Sometimes it can get a little bit messy, and I think, frankly, that's the sign of a healthy, wonderful organization that will continue to grow. I think I was always a bit of a rebel, but I finally found the right cause. You know, frankly, I've always believed that the person has to be determining his or her own future. And people say, well, what's civil liberties all about? What's human rights all about? It's the right to live with dignity, no matter what, no matter who you are. Whether you're gay or straight, a citizen or immigrant, a woman or a man, whether you're a member of the NAACP or the Nazi Party. Frankly, in America, you've got rights, no matter who you are, no matter how much you love someone or you hate someone. And frankly, that is the beauty of our nation, that these rights don't attach to you because you're of one group or you're wealthy or you're popular. It's often the unpopular who have the greatest difficulty exercising their rights. I often tell people, Mary Poppins doesn't come into our office and tell us that she's been tortured because they took away her umbrella. It's some of the most difficult clients and defendants who've been tortured. And you might not like the clients and you might not like what they're being accused of, but frankly, we can't change what they did to us. We can change what we did to them. And it's often taking those very controversial cases and some of the most unappetizing of clients or the most unappetizing of facts that we protect the core values that protect everybody on the street. And it's for me, that's been always the thing that I've always cared most about the ACLU. It was always a place where you could work on the rights of all people. You know, I'm gay, but I don't only care about gay rights. I'm Latino, but I care about the rights of African Americans. I'm a man, but I care about women's rights. And what's remarkable is that this is an organization that's dedicated to protecting the rights of all people. And sometimes people have they turn their noses at us and say, how could you defend that person? Or why are you concerned with terrorists at Guantanamo? Why are you concerned with the Nazi Party? Or why are you concerned about the Ku Klux Klan's right to freedom of speech and freedom of association? It's because whenever you allow the government to begin to chop away those rights for individuals who are not popular, you'll soon find that those rights are a lot less stable and secure in the lives of all Americans. And that's the beauty of this organization. I mean, what's old is what's new. And I think it will be always the challenge of this democracy to confront government abuse and government trampling on individual rights. When we first started in 1920, women didn't have the right to vote. Blacks were still being lynched and treated like second-class citizens. Gay people, forget it. There was no rights for gay people at that time. And there was no Supreme Court case yet in 1920 that would uphold a First Amendment's free speech rights. That came almost a decade later. What's remarkable now is that some of the things that we take for granted were the struggle of some of the early individuals who said you're always going to need a countervailing force to government abuse. That is our job. We will always be the watchdog for people's rights. And we are not an organization that's ever going to go out of business. We can't. For as long as you have the United States of America, as long as you have individuals who use their power often in abusive ways or discretionary or capricious ways, you're going to need an ACLU to stand up against that government abuse. And so I think of us as a permanent fixture in the American political landscape. Just like we can never imagine America without Harvard or Princeton or some of these great research universities, we can't ever imagine an America without the ACLU. These rights need someone who's going to be the watchdog, no matter what, and to speak truth to power, and to take on popular presidents and take on unpopular presidents and hold their feet to the fire in exactly the same way. Because if we don't, then we'll quickly find ourselves in not the country we think we belong in. Yeah, I mean, actually, it was more watching the lives of my parents. My parents came from Puerto Rico. My father didn't speak English all that well at all when he got here. Spoke it okay, not that great when he died. He finished the 4th grade. My mother finished the 8th grade. My father worked for 30-some-odd years at a big hotel in New York. I remember when he first started out as a houseman, which is a polite word for a janitor at a hotel. I worked in the same hotel every Christmas and summer break all through college. That's how I paid my bills to go to Princeton. I remember he wanted to go from being a janitor to being a waiter, and he was told that his English wasn't good enough. And he didn't really buy it because he knew the waiters of the hotel. A lot of them had very thick accents too. They just happened to be Italian or Greek or German or Russian. There was one guy who was Greek whose English was worse than my father's. And so he filed a grievance through his union, and he got the job as a waiter. In fact, he was a banquet waiter. He always had a great sense of humor. He said, frankly, you know, I don't really need to speak English all that well because when you're serving banquet, everybody gets chicken. Everybody gets steak. You know, you serve coffee or tea. It's the only thing you have to ask people about, and he certainly had the vocabulary for that. When he got the job, our lives changed. We moved out of public housing, and we were living in public housing in the Bronx. We moved out to a kind of a working class community in New Jersey, much nicer environment. We got our first car. I got my first stereo. My mother got her new living room set. They stopped fighting over money. I think we began to see new possibilities open before us. We took our first and only family vacation to Walt Disney World. And frankly, there was the kind of discrimination that would have kept my father as a janitor, not as a waiter, that made me understand the power of the law. There was no lawyer in my family for me to kind of use as a role model. I don't know how. I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. And I think that was the first personal event in my young life that made me think about injustice and the possibility of righting a wrong. And I still think that's often what drives me today. You know, as a gay man, I know I don't have the rights of straight people. I'm lucky enough that I'm a Princeton, Stanford graduate with some resources at my disposal. I can contract for many of the rights in my personal relationship that I would otherwise be given as a matter of law if I were a heterosexual. But frankly, there are some rights I won't ever be able to get. If I die, my partner would not be able to receive my Social Security benefits. It's not clear that if I picked up and moved anywhere in the country that I would be protected in the same way if I were a heterosexual couple from discrimination, if we were a heterosexual couple. And the fact is that even when you're able to transact for some of the ways in which you can protect a couple or protect two same-sex partners, the law provides you so much greater protection than we're able to contract for. And so frankly, in America, even though I feel fully empowered and I'm very lucky to have the privilege to lead this organization and make a difference in the world, in my life, I still consider myself a second-class citizen by law, not by fact, but by design, by public policy. And frankly, until that changes, that's going to be the reality for many people across this country. And that's not different from a lot of people who either is Hispanic or African-American or immigrant descent encounter discrimination every day in their lives, often in much more aggressive ways than I confront in my life. I'm fortunate in the fact that I can dress up in a suit and kind of walk down the street, and I'm not going to get profiled in the way that other people get profiled by law enforcement officials. But in America, we're still very far away from living up to the aspirations that we've set out for ourselves. The reality is that we're very far away along from achieving that. Look, we are still hopeful that President Obama will keep the promises he made as candidate. But there are some early signs that we're not going down the right path. He told us we would reject the Military Commissions Act, and yet now he's talking about retaining the military commissions as a way to deal with some of the detainees at Guantanamo. Huge mistake. You can't fix that. You got to scrap it. You got to throw these individuals into established courts. You can't tinker at the edges with the Military Commissions Act. He told us he would restore the rule of law, and yet now he's telling us that he wants to enact a preventive detention regime, which is essentially a nice word for holding people indefinitely without charge or trial. Can't do that. That's not the American way. We've never allowed that for hundreds of years. America cannot hold people who we are suspicious of merely because they may pose a threat if you can't prove it. You can't take away someone's fundamental right to liberty and do so in a way that doesn't convict the person in a court of law. That's just, it's anathema to the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. You have the president telling us that he was going to make good on some core issues around gay rights and questions around equality in America that seem to be very slow in coming. You know, saying that I'm going to give gay and lesbian people their full rights as individuals, and yet defending the Defense of Marriage Act, it doesn't compute. Frankly, if those promises were made, you can't defend the Defense of Marriage Act. You can't drag your feet on don't ask, don't tell. And I think one of the concerns we have is that the president is saying, I have all these other issues that are on the front burner, the economy, the wars, healthcare. We all get that. We're all Americans. We all care about people dying in wars. We all care about healthcare. We all care about the economy. But frankly, we can't wait to fix all those problems before we get to some really important problems that he and he alone in his government can fix. You can't sequence it in a way that's going to, you're going to fix the economy and the healthcare and the environment and the wars, and then we'll turn to gay people and the administration of justice and detainees and torture and abuse. It's not, we're never going to get to it. And frankly, everyone knows that it's the first 18 months of administration that will allow him the room and the latitude to make decisive breaks with the past. And unless we occupy that initial window with some really bold, decisive actions, we'll find ourselves in a new re-election campaign. We'll find ourselves with pundits on both sides saying defer these issues further until the second term. And frankly, a dream deferred is a dream lost. And frankly, time is not a luxury we can afford ourselves when it comes to core issues like due process and human rights and equality. And that's why we're hoping that putting his feet to the fire on these issues, that he'll get the political will to do the right thing.